Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to Season 3 of the Logical Christian Podcast. I'm your Logical Christian, Dan Irwin. The Logical Christian Podcast is not here to tell you what to think. It's an exercise in how to think. Rather than just accept what we're being told with regard to current events, politics, science, religion, and everything else, we're going to stop the spin, ask questions, dive deep, and look at the world logically. And since logic is a gift from God, most importantly, we're going to look at it all as Christians. Links can be found in the show notes if you'd like to follow along. So with that, let's go be logical Christians. If there's one thing I know, it's that you never drink orange juice after brushing your teeth. But if there are two things I know, first, it's the orange juice thing. Then it's that you don't need to know what you're doing. You just need to convincingly act like you do. I've often said that if anybody finds out I have no idea what I'm doing in my career, I guess I'll be working the fry-o-lator next to Kamala. But I'm at nearly 24 years playing this charade. Another 40 years and I can think about retiring. On today's episode, first we'll watch the truth slowly evolve, then we'll give credit where credit might be due, and finally, well, no need to be cryptic on this one, it's time to update the goals, so, kind of fits right in with the theme, doesn't it? So first, let me suggest you prepare for the shock of a lifetime. Then on your feet, soldier, girl boss on deck, and finally, fake it or make it. You be the judge. And here we go. This is where doing something like this, having a podcast, well, it gets hard. But unlike our mainstream government media outlets, some of us believe that when you're wrong, you must admit your errors, beg for forgiveness, correct the record, and then try harder going forward. In the past, maybe even a few times, I've openly mocked the idea of Darwinian evolution. I mean, yes, there's no proof. No, we've never actually seen any evidence of evolution. I know that there are those who are enamored by the idea that claim they have evidence, but what they actually have are bones or varieties of species or the like. But shouldn't we see evolution in action? They say it's very slow, but shouldn't we have a variety of things in transition that are, out there as well? And that's always been one of my showstoppers, one of the reasons I've mercilessly mocked the idea. I mean, just look around you. Are we literally claiming that evolution started on this planet just one time, only once, in one place, and created everything that we see today? Not only that, but continue to look around, and are we expected to believe that everything has reached its final evolutionary form at this point in time? We see all things. They seem to not be changing into other things. Things, for the most part, seem to be well adapted to their surroundings. It appears that evolution is, for lack of a better term, done. And see, that's the kind of silly, ignorant thinking that eventually get flat earth, moon, soundstage, science-denying, Bible-believing, mouth-breathing hillbillies like me in trouble. Because now, well, it appears my uppance has come. My Piper-paying time has arrived, and my disgrace isn't just based on one finding, but in fact, three. Three clear examples of evolution, refutations of my ignorance. All in articles released very recently. And wow, is my face red. And no, it's not from eating a bunch of jelly donuts this time. So before I offer my sincerest of apologies, I think we should work our way through these three articles so that you and I can be as informed as possible as to why my apology is what it will be. Article the first, found on Daily Galaxy via MSN.com, headline, Scientists reveal dogs are entering a new phase of evolution. Now look, I'm not a fan of the theory of evolution, but I do like dogs, and if they can evolve into even gooder boys, well, I'm all for it. But if they're evolving into boys not as good, well, I, for one, am not for that at all. I'm against that. They need to be good boys. So what are we talking about here? Well, researchers at Linköping University in Sweden recently finished a study, quote, investigating how dogs have developed the ability to communicate and work with humans over time. This study involved 60 golden retrievers, and let me just quote this, as you would likely never believe me if I just told you they said it, quote, who were tested on their ability to ask for help when trying to open a jar that had been intentionally sealed to make it impossible for the dogs to open on their own. Dogs that were given an oxytocin nasal spray were more likely to turn to their owners for assistance, showing a stronger social connection. Okay, so dogs can't open jars. They ain't got no thumbs. Their findings, of giving thumbless dogs sealed jars to open, that they somehow knew, I guess, needed to be opened, and then drugging them, was that possibly, quote, dogs with a particular genetic variant of the oxytocin receptor are more sensitive to the hormone, making them better suited to interact and form bonds with humans. And there you have it. Boom goes the evolution. What, not seeing it? Okay, well, let's back up just a bit then, which will undoubtedly clear all of this up. Okay, the article states that back in the day, dogs were working animals. They would herd livestock, they'd assist in hunting, they'd protect property and people, but those roles have slowly faded to the exception now, not the norm for dogs. Now we have a lot of support and service type dogs attuned to their owners. These scientists believe that this change in the expectation of humans is driving a change in dogs, principally through a change in the love hormone, oxytocin. Sort of. I don't know. Let's back up a bit. I'm going to try to get this new phase of dog evolution correct, scientifically, of course. So dogs used to be wolves. That's not really far enough. Okay, let's do this. 180 million years ago, we got mammals. I think that's pretty common knowledge at this point. 85 million years ago, we had the Boreoeutheria, which I'm pretty sure has too many vowels, all crammed in one location. That thing that I just basically said, that split off of the mammals. One branch went toward rodents. The other branch went toward carnivorans. Then, of course, we had bats split off from that 71 million years ago. Probably went off to plan their viral destruction of mankind. Mankind yet to be evolved, of course. The cat-like carnivorans split off 51.4 million years ago. Then the dog-like carnivorans split off 44.9 million years ago. Then a series of splits peeling off the foxes and the raccoons, some wolves, but not all, and then more wolves, but still not all, coyotes and jackals, and then 1.12 million years ago, the gray wolf and what led to the domesticated dog split off from the rest. Okay, so now that we know the evolutionary history, which is definitely absolutely verified and correct, we jump back to our article and find out that between 40,000 and 14,000 years ago, dogs began to be domesticated. I think that's what they're calling the first phase of evolution of dogs. That just kind of simmered, I guess, with dogs being domesticated, but used for more work, hunting, and protective type duties for nearly all, in fact, of the 40,000 to 14,000 years. Then after the Industrial Revolution, so, like 100 years ago, we thought, hey, we could breed dogs to make them into what we want them to be. Now, why that didn't occur to people for 40,000 to 14,000 years, I have no idea. But here we are. So that is apparently the second phase of this dog evolution. But now we want doggos to be gooder boys, so we're domesticating them, focusing on service-type dogs. So, more attuned to human needs. This is apparently the third phase. The authors of the study are quoted as saying, quote, "For the happiness of dogs and their owners, humans need to breed and train more dogs like service animals, embarking on a new wave of dog domestication to help them fit into the new world we have created." The end. Like, seriously, that's where that article ends. So let's recap what we've learned here. Something, evolution, then 40,000 to 14,000 years ago, dogs were domesticated and used as helpers for working, etc., by people. Then they were bred into the different breeds we see today for whatever reason, and now we're using certain breeds differently because they seem to be better suited for certain types of service-type tasks. Hashtag evolution. Oh, okay. I can sense your confusion regarding how this is evolution. I can almost hear you saying silly, unscientific things like, but we have no proof that dogs evolved from anything millions of years ago. Or some sort of speciesist, racist, sexist, I'm not really sure, comments like, what about Noah and 2 of 1 or more dog kinds all on the ark, which was only like 4,500 years ago, which refutes the 40,000 to 14,000 year ago thing. And I dismiss that statement based on your religious bias and clear hatred. And probably the most ignorant statement a non-scientist like you could make. But we started with a dog and we ended with a dog. How is this evolution? Look, if you're just going to play games like that, I'm not willing to go there with you. Just amazing. Well, look. Science denier, let's see what you have to say for the next one. Found on phys.org, that's Phys, phys.org, clever. Headline, Evolution in Real Time. Scientists predict and witness evolution in a 30-year marine snail experiment. Okay. So let me start with a little background work again. We're going to be discussing the Littorina saxatilis, also known as black-lined periwinkle, a species of marine snail. We'll specifically be looking at the crab and wave snail. So snails, or at least arthropods, and mollusks evolved from a multicellular creature about 500 million years ago or so. Again, I know I'm probably talking down to you. This is fairly common knowledge. From there, our little evolutionary tree drills down and down and down through the different species, but it doesn't give any sort of time frame. So I'm kind of assuming that all these little things evolved and speciated around the 500 million years ago time frame, but I don't know that for sure. Spoiler alert, neither do they. Next, you need to know that a skerry, that's Skerry, a skerry is a small rocky island, for lack of a better term. We're talking about an island of like square feet or square meters, something very small, something humans couldn't live on for sure. Okay, so in 1988, a small group of islands called the Coaster Archipelago off the Swedish west coast experienced a dense bloom of toxic algae. Now, due to this, marine snail populations were wiped out on a number of these small skerries. These things were only a few square meters in area, and they were very nearly wiped out on some of the larger islands. Within a few years, the snail population rebounded on a number of spots, but they just couldn't reestablish themselves on some of these small skerries. So in 1992, Kirsten Johannesson, a marine ecologist from the University of Gothenburg, Sweden, decided to reintroduce these snails to one of the skerries. This resulted in a collaboration between the University of Gothenburg and the Institute of Science and Technology Austria and Nord University of Norway to, quote, predict and witness evolution in the making. Specifically in this area, there are 2 kinds of snails, as I mentioned, that live close, or in some cases, they actually live together. And these are, like I said, the crab and the wave ecotype marine snail. These snails, when examined closely, because they're small, are very distinct. Wave snails are smaller with thinner shells and a large rounded opening in the shell, and they are apparently, per the article, bold in their behavior. I don't know if you've ever had a snail come at you boldly. I have not, and frankly, I'm a little terrified to think of that. The crab snails are larger, with thicker shells, smaller ovalish openings, and they're more timid. I like them better. So prior to the algae bloom, wave snails were on these skerries, and both types were on the nearby shorelines. After this bloom wiped out some of the skerries and just completely cleaned them off of the wave snails, Johannesson decided to mess with the snails and put crab snails where the wave snails used to be. Seems cruel. They predicted that the crab snails would adapt to their surroundings over time. And with these snails moving through 1 to 2 generations each year, the study team could watch this evolution happen in real time. Within a decade, or 10 years, whichever comes first, they saw evidence that these crab snails were in fact adapting. And over the 30 years, they watched marine snails on a rock. Side note, when you wonder what you're doing with your life and are you making a difference, just think, your entire working career could be watching snails on a rock, then feel confident that whatever it is that you are doing, it's gotta be more impactful than that. So in the 30 years of this snail rock watching, they were able to predict a number of things, what the snails would look like and what would happen genetically, and also etc. What they found as they watched is that within the first few years, the transplanted snails, quote, modified their shape to adjust to their new environment, but the population also quickly started to change genetically. Well, so how could this happen? Short answer, evolution, right? Longer answer, quote, they showed that the snail's rapid and dramatic transformation was possibly due to two complementary processes: a fast selection of traits already present at a low frequency in the transplanted crab snail population, and gene flow from neighboring wave snails that could have simply rafted over 160 meters to reach the skerry. Let me put that in layman's terms. The traits for size and shape were already available in the transplanted snail's genetic makeup, much like the traits for different eye color, hair color, nose shape, height, etc. are available in our genetic makeup, with some being more dominant, which show up in our reproduced offspring. Second, wave snails weren't that far away, and in a relatively short order, it at least appears that some of them could have made their way over to this rock, from that rock. Then the wave and crab snails took care of a little snaily business and made some hybrid baby snails, which apparently took on the dominant traits of the wave snails. So, the article tells us, quote, the snails did not evolve these traits entirely from scratch. The snail's access to a large gene pool drove this rapid evolution. It goes on to say, quote, in theory, scientists know that a species with high enough genetic variation can adapt more rapidly to change. However, few studies aimed to experiment with evolution over time in the wild. Now, one of the researchers, it's A-N-J-A, would that be Anna, Anya? I have no idea. Marie Westrom said, quote, not all species have access to large gene pools, and evolving new traits from scratch is tediously slow. Adaptation is very complex, and our planet is also facing complex changes with episodes of weather extremes, rapidly advancing climate change, pollution, and new parasites. And so, all right, so as to not leave you hanging, in only 30 short years, this transplanted snail population has grown to a thriving 1,000 individual snails, give or take, altogether now. Aww. So there you have it. Evolution! Now, if it wasn't for such compelling evidence right before our eyes, in only 30 years, just decimating any possibility of me debating their claim, in my former life, I might have said some things such as, so it started as a snail and it ended as a snail, where's the evolution? Or I might have said something like, so two types of snails that apparently can reproduce and create baby snails, reproduced and created baby snails. Or I might have said something like, well, it kind of sounds like for whatever reason the wave snails are better adapted to these skerries than the crab snails, so it's quite likely that any snails born that were of the crab snail configuration either died or were washed out to sea or onto the shore, while the wave snail configuration babies were able to survive on the skerries. And that's not evolution. It's a type of selection. It's a survival of the fittest for that environment, but that's not evolution. Or I might have said something along the lines of, notice how they keep flip-flopping between the words adaptation and evolution? Those are not synonymous, especially how they're using them here. See, they make it very clear that the genetic code was already there for the variability in snail type, which really helped the scientists see this evolution in action, and then they make the statement, evolving new traits from scratch is tediously slow, which is absolutely correct. It is so slow, in fact, that we've never seen it happen, nor do we have any evidence of it happening ever, in all of history, anywhere, whichever timeline of history you choose to believe. I'd probably go on to say something like, this is bait and switch. They scientifically prove that wave snails are better able to survive on the skerries. That's true, but they claim evolution when there is no evolution at all, because evolution is creating something from nothing, specifically something better or of higher order, and that's not what we see here. And I probably would have said something ignorant and naive like, if I wanted a race of 8-foot-tall humans, I would start with the population, allow each human to get to their full, mature height, then kill those below a certain height, allowing only the tallest to procreate. I would continue doing that generation after generation, and eventually I'd either hit a height limit for humans, or I'd have my 8-foot-tall super race. That's not evolution. That's genetic selection. It's actually what Hitler wanted to do, to be honest, to make the Ubermensch, right? The Superman. In the case of these snails, it occurred naturally, as it does in all of nature. Those with the genetic traits that allow them to survive are able to pass those dominant traits to the next generation. Those who can't survive typically have a harder time passing anything except for away. Those are things I might have said, comments I might have made, had the evidence for genetic adaptation evolution from snail to snail using already available genetic code not been so clearly displayed before my eyes in only 30 years. Hashtag evolution. But I know, some of you are skeptical still. Although we've clearly demonstrated doggo evolution and snailo evolution, some of you are hard cases, choosing religious bigotry and obliviousness over science fact. Well, for you science deniers, I'll give you one more proof, and if after that one you still deny the totally scientific theory... No, not a theory. Again, the scientific fact of evolution, well, I guess we'll just take note for future re-educational purposes. Found on ScienceAlert.com, headline, Humans are evolving right before our eyes on the Tibetan Plateau. Yep, you heard it here first. Humans still evolving. Take that. If the science fiction movies over the last 70 years have told us anything, humans should be evolving something like telekinetic powers or the ability to fly or like a third eye in the back of our heads or something useful like that because, as we know, evolution is completely random and totally controllable by simply deciding that we need something brand new added to our code. Let's see what we're getting. I bet it's going to be good. Okay, so you know how the higher you go, the thinner the oxygen is, right? That's why playing sports in, say, Denver, a mile above sea level, is harder on athletes who spend most of their time at locations closer to sea level. Those athletes assigned to that area are more suited to playing at that high altitude because their bodies have adapted to the difference, and subsequently it would make sense that when they play at altitudes closer to sea level, they would have more stamina because the oxygen content would be higher. Think of an airplane. You're flying along 36,000 feet, and let's say a window decides to leave the chat. The plane depressurizes very rapidly. In fact, there's a scientific term for that, rapid depressurization. The airplane actually has the ability to regulate pressure inside the cabin. If you didn't know that, you might not be a flyer. So although your ears pop as you ascend through the skies, the pilots are actually ensuring the pressurization of the plane stays relatively close to what you'd experience at sea level. Since the pressure at 36,000 feet on the outside of the airplane is so much less, when the window is yeeted, that pressure inside escapes rapidly to the outside. At 36,000 feet, you have seconds to maybe a few minutes before you pass out due to oxygen deprivation. That's why those little oxygen masks fall out of the ceiling, and although you've ignored the stewardess or the steward and their safety speech over and over again, that's why you give the tubing a good firm tug to start the chemical reaction in the little bottle in the ceiling. That's why you put your mask on first before you pass out, then you help others. Now see, when the pilot gets the depressurization alarm, they put on their oxygen masks that are fed from large tanks, allowing them more than the 5 to 10 minutes of oxygen you get through your mask, and then they declare an emergency, and they do a hard dive to get to a maximum of 20,000 feet. At 20,000 feet, although it'll feel weird and it'll definitely be labored, the oxygen is dense enough that you can breathe without a mask. That's why our masks in the back of the plane only have to last for 5-10 minutes, something like that, because the pilot should have you down to a breathable atmosphere in that much time, probably less. Okay, with all that in mind, in the Tibetan Plateau, people have been living, well, the article says for 10,000 years, whatever, at an elevation of somewhere around 11,500 feet. Now take note, that's about double the elevation of Denver, about half of the maximum elevation, allowing most humans the ability to breathe without the assistance of outside oxygen sources. So the article starts with this, quote, "Humans are not yet done cooking. We're continuing to evolve and adjust to the world around us, the records of our adaptations written in our bodies." Anthropologist Cynthia Beale of Case Western Reserve University has been studying these Tibetan Plateauites for some time now and has concluded that, quote, "the bodies of those living there have changed in ways that allow the inhabitants to make the most of an atmosphere that for most humans would result in not enough oxygen being delivered via blood cells to the body's tissues, a condition known as hypoxia." Now, I'm not an expert, but I'm not sure we'd experience hypoxia at 11,500 feet. But I don't know, maybe if you do strenuous labor like farming, building, etc., you'd be more susceptible as your body needs more oxygen, so maybe you would. Let's just say that you would for purposes of this discussion. So Ms. Beale says that humans have evolved and adjusted in order to live and thrive at this altitude, and she and her team wanted to know why. In order to do this, quote, "the researchers delved into one of the markers of what we call evolutionary fitness, reproductive success. Women who deliver live babies are those who pass on their traits to the next generation." This science article makes a quite astute observation. Well, a few of them, actually, if I'm being honest. If a woman at this elevation survives pregnancy and gives birth to a live child, there's a higher possibility of success in passing her genes and traits to that child. Now, you'll want to just kind of soak in that wisdom just for a little bit of time. Okay, long enough. The article also observes that, and get ready for this, quote, "these women are more likely to give birth to more babies, and those babies, having inherited survivability traits from their mothers, are also more likely to survive to adulthood and pass the traits on to the next generation." Yeah, science, right? Also deduced, quote, "women who start reproducing young and have long marriages seem to have a longer exposure to the possibility of pregnancy, which also increases the number of live births," the researchers found. I mean, we are unmasking timeless mysteries here. So not to delve too deeply into the biological science because, boring. All right. The research studied 417 women between 46 and 86 years old, lifetime inhabitants of the 11,500-foot altitudes, or higher in some cases, and they noted the number of live births. They found an average number of 5.2 live births per woman, ranging between 0 and 14 for each woman. They looked at markers of health, physical measurements, and most importantly, their blood and circulatory system. They zeroed in on the hemoglobin, which is what's responsible for transporting oxygen to the tissues of the body. They found that those who had the highest number of live births had what would be considered to be a normal hemoglobin level. Too low would result in lower oxygen transported. Too high would thicken the blood and put extra strain on the heart to try to pump it. But they found that the hemoglobin in the women with the highest number of live births had a high oxygen saturation level. They also found that, quote, "the women with the highest reproductive success rates also had a high rate of blood flow into the lungs, and their hearts had wider than average left ventricles, the chamber of the heart responsible for pumping oxygenated blood into the body. Taken all together, these traits increase the rate of oxygen transport and delivery, enabling the human body to make the most of the low oxygen in the air respired." Beale concluded, quote, "this is a case of ongoing natural selection. Understanding how populations like these adapt give us a better grasp on the processes of human evolution." There you have it. Human evolution, right before our eyes. Now what say you? And please, please, don't say something naive like, "we started with a human and ended with a human." That's not evolution. I just dismiss that kind of ignorance just immediately. Please don't try the tired old trope of this is simply a natural selection where those who possess the genetic traits most suitable for the environment survive and pass those traits to the next generation. That, although completely accurate, is not very nice to say when trying to push the evolution narrative. And I absolutely refuse to even hear the argument that this is what we see in all populations, every people group, every ethnicity around the globe, having certain things that are different than other groups, from external physical features to the exact development and workings of the squishy innards, and that's why certain populations are more susceptible to certain conditions or diseases and others are not. That is just crazy talk. So with all that said, the part we've all been waiting for, my evolutionary-based apology. Well, let me say this. From the beginning of this article to this very point, my apology has evolved slightly. I'm sorry to you, my listener, for having wasted your time. Yeah, see, what we see here is the glory of God's design. The dog kind, the human kind, even snail kind, given the ability within very distinct boundaries to adapt and change, learn and grow and fit into the environment they're in. God's design was and is perfect. Sin, of course, has marred it. It's introduced disease and failures, things wear out. But just think about 6,000 years of creation. Think of how many copies upon copies of humans have been made and how well we're still reproducing the next generation. Think about snails. With a generation per year, maybe 2, and how many generations they've just kept making more snails. Dogs coming from a pair of dogs, probably similar to a wolf of some kind, maybe a few pairs of different kinds of dogs, and look at what adapted naturally. And then look at how man has modified them through breeding, even if we shouldn't have done it in many cases because, wow, do we have some freak dogs out there. But look at all the genetic variations that God baked into the original dogs. And humans, look all around, red and yellow, black and white, and so many others around the world. And think that Adam and Eve had all of these traits, everything we see today, inside their genetic code, and probably many, many more that we don't see today, because what we see today is what Noah's 3 sons and their wives had available in their genetic code, which most assuredly was not as much potential variation as Adam and Eve were created with. And still, we're all so different, yet still the same race, one blood, so many differences. It's simply amazing to think about what that first chapter of Genesis actually entails. When God created the trees, the land animals, the bugs, the fish, the birds, the plants, and humans, the complexity in the design and the complexity in the ability to adapt. It's unfathomable. And God didn't just make us to be perfect and then go back to the drawing board to figure out, what do I do now that sin has entered the world? No, God created us to withstand the effects of sin and entropy and disease and viruses, bacteria, and everything else right from the beginning. Not to mention, look at G-forces that we now have been able to withstand. Variations in gravity, all the way down to no gravity. Variation in oxygen content. Variation in exposure to solar radiation. And think about the fact that in a growing number of cases, we have now interchangeable parts. And some parts and functions we can actually replicate for a time or manufacture a part to replace a worn-out part, and the body can adapt and utilize those parts. Look at the brain and how it can be dramatically damaged, and given time in varying degrees, the rest of the brain picks up the slack. And the list just goes on, ad infinitum. God's creation is an amazing thing. Evolution is a silly, godless, unprovable, impossible fairy tale. Scientists, journals, and articles like these claim evolution and either speak of things that have nothing to do with evolution at all, or they bait and switch us to speak of adaptation or inherited traits or dominant traits, all the while telling us what evolution probably does, or definitely does, we just don't have any proof of it. Yeah, I think I'll stick with the Bible, with the creation account in Genesis, with the line that we're often mocked for saying, God did it. Because I have never seen, nor will I ever see, any article, any evidence, anything that could convince me otherwise, because it doesn't exist, and neither evidence nor some reason to believe isn't going to just evolve out of nothing. Israel. What can you say about Old Testament Israel? What a bunch of cotton-headed ninny-muggins, am I right? These guys, they just kept sinning and doing evil in the sight of the Lord. What a bunch of foolish mortals. I, for one, am glad that I live in a more sophisticated time in human history, a time where we've learned the lessons of those who went before us, so we don't just keep falling into judgment upon judgment. Right? Anybody? Hello? Yeah. So, welcome back to part 9. Some may say part the last, because this is the last part of our Hear Them Roar miniseries. Miniseries nobody asked for, and I didn't intend on producing. But here we are. The year was 1405 BC. The place, the Promised Land. Joshua, the son of Nun, had just led the Israelites into the Promised Land after being appointed by God to take over from Moses. Joshua was, for all intents and purposes, the final leader of the tribe of Israel. Some may call him the first judge of Israel, but if we wanted to call him a judge, we'd kind of have to call Moses a judge also, wouldn't we? And most people wouldn't say that, so I think we'll just agree with what appears to be the majority and say that Joshua was not actually a judge. What we do know is that Joshua, as Moses did before him, was tasked with the impossible mission to keep the Israelites from straying away from following Yahweh God. I can't even manage myself. I can't imagine trying to manage a few million of me. For about 25 years, Joshua oversaw the Israelites, with much of that spent battling, conquering, wiping out the pagan nations and taking over the land. And why would they do this? Because God told them to. See, the nations that had previously inhabited that land were pagan, idol-worshipping, wicked people. God had finally had enough of their ways and used Israel to wipe them all out of existence, which, incidentally, is God's prerogative. He's the owner of all, including you and me. It's his right to do with any and all of us as he sees fit, keeping in mind that not one thing happens that's not in God's plan from before time. Anyway, I say wiped out all, but that's not exactly correct. As we move from the book of Joshua to Judges, we find out in chapter 1 that Israel does not, in fact, conquer all the lands of the people. Chapter 2 starts with a very sad beginning of the nation of Israel, absent Moses, and in only a few weeks, absent Joshua as well. Quote, "Then the angel of Yahweh came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land, which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall cut no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not listened to my voice. What is this you have done? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you. But they will become as thorns in your sides, and their gods will become a snare to you. So it happened that when the angel of Yahweh spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to Yahweh." That section was verses 1 through 5 of chapter 2. By verse 8, Joshua has died. By verse 10, the entire generation who had entered in with Joshua had died. We're told that, quote, "The people served Yahweh all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who saw all the great work of Yahweh which he had done for Israel." Then verse 10 ends with, quote, "And there arose another generation after them who did not know Yahweh or even the work which he had done for Israel." Now that statement isn't saying that they never heard of it. I guarantee they heard of all that happened from Exodus on, but it likely became what the Bible has become to so many people today, just a myth, a collection of stories, history with very little application to today. So verse 11 starts a pattern we see over and over in the Old Testament, and if we're being honest, in our own lives as well. Quote, "Then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and served the Baals, and they forsook Yahweh, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked Yahweh to anger. So they forsook Yahweh and served Baal and the Ashtaroth, and the anger of Yahweh burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers, who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies." And this is where a cycle begins that Israel would repeat over and over and over and over again. The people reject Yahweh, they worship their idols, they fall into sin, and God is angered. God uses an enemy nation to oppress the Israelites. The people eventually cry out in repentance. God raises up a judge to fight for the Israelites and free them from their oppressors. There is peace in the land of Israel in varying degrees, and because they turn back to God. Then the judge dies. And then the people reject Yahweh and they worship idols, fall into sin, and the cycle repeats itself. So moving into chapter 3 of Judges, we find out that although, yes, it was the Israelites who did not remove all the nations from the promised land, it was actually Yahweh who allowed certain nations to remain, quote, to test Israel by them, in order that the generations of the sons of Israel would know war by learning war, especially those who had not known it formerly. As with everything, we clearly see God's sovereignty in all things, yet we see man's responsibility in their own choices. By verse 6, we find out that the Israelites were taking wives from the women of these other pagan nations. Quote, "Thus the sons of Israel did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and forgot Yahweh their God, and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth." So God sold them into the hand of the king of Mesopotamia for 8 years, and Israel finally cried out to God. This was when God raised up the first in a line of judges, Othniel. Othniel, through the power of the Holy Spirit, fought against this king. God gave the king over to him, and Israel had peace for 4 years. Then Othniel died. Quote, "Then the sons of Israel again did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. This time God gave them into the hand of the Moabites. This time they were oppressed for 18 years. Again, the Israelites finally cried out to Yahweh. God again raised up a judge to rescue them, Ehud, a left-handed man. Not sure why that matters, but the Bible tells us that. This is kind of the gross story of Ehud coming to the king of the Moabites, Eglon, and buried a short sword into the fat of his belly, which Ehud had to leave in there because it apparently surrounded the entire thing. Then as Ehud left and escaped, Eglon's servants thought he was maybe dropping the kids off at the old pool. You know, seeing a man about a duck, doing some paperwork. You get the idea. And they just kind of waited and waited. And they waited, and they finally thought, we might have waited too long, and they came in to find him dead. Meanwhile, Ehud went back to the Israelites and told them to pursue their oppressors. God has given them into their hands. About 10,000 Moabites were killed that day. Israel was freed, and they had peace for 80 years. Shamgar was the next judge, and all we know about him is that he rescued the Israelites from the Philistines, killing 600 of them with an ox goad. Chapter 4 starts with Israel again doing evil in the eyes of Yahweh. Ehud was dead, apparently Shamgar was dead, and God handed them over to the king of Canaan. There was severe oppression for 20 years this time. And with that, we get to our subject for this segment, the prophetess Deborah. She was the judge of Israel at that time. It's not necessarily as much of an honor as it's made out to be. Deborah summoned Barak and told him that God had instructed him to take 10,000 men, go where he instructs him, and God would give the oppressing army into their hands. Barak answered God's command, saying to Deborah, quote, "If you will go with me, then I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go." Now, for the sake of clarity, Barak is telling Deborah that he ain't going if she ain't going. Deborah agrees, but tells him that the honor for the victory that's about to happen will not be his, it will actually be a woman's. This woman will defeat the commander of the army. So they went with the 10,000 men. The Canaanite army came just as God said they would, and Deborah had to tell Barak to go get them, because apparently he didn't just take the initiative. I don't know. God's already given them to you. Now go get. God, as he did multiple times in the Old Testament, threw the oppressors into confusion, and Barak and his men slaughtered the army. The captain had left his chariot, however, fled on foot, made his way to the tent of Jael, the wife of Eber, the Kenite, who was at peace with the king, apparently, and she told him to come on into the tent. She gave him some milk, a little bit of cheese, covered him with a rug, told him that she would stand guard in case anyone came looking for him. Then, when he was completely out, from being exhausted and having his belly full, She took a tent peg and a hammer and, drove the peg through his head, through his head and into the ground. Quote, so he died. Yeah, I'd say he probably died. That would be pretty sure. Yep. Barak, lagging behind, finally pulled up to Jael's tent. She told him the captain was inside, that she'd killed him for him. And the Israelites in short order were able to free themselves, or more accurately, Yahweh freed them from this round of oppression, and they had now 40 years of peace. And that is Deborah. That's all we know of her. Now, chapter 5 of Judges, we have a song sung by Deborah and Barak on the day of that battle, and that's all of chapter 5. It's a sort of poetic, recent history, starts with praising God. She jumps into the timeline by mentioning Shamgar, and then the waywardness of the Israelites. Then she sings about herself rising up as, quote, a mother in Israel. She then recounts the calling of Barak to lead the battle and the battle itself. Yahweh's giving them into their hands. She then gives Jael an entire stanza of the song about how she killed the captain of the army with a tent peg to the melon, and it wraps up with the Israelites and Yahweh defeating their enemies. This is all we know about Deborah. Deborah was Israel's only female judge. Now, some will point to this to try to justify women as having the ability or right to serve as pastors or elders or whatever, despite what the New Testament says, and that's incorrect. Some say that she was chosen at that time as a sign of the softer side of God, to act not as a brutish, warmongering man, but to show comfort and peace during a time of oppression. And, okay, yeah, maybe. But what we find out is that it at least appears that in short order, God told her to call a man to gather an army and slaughter the oppressors. So you can take comfort in that, I guess. I think the position I would take is one taken by a number of theologians and scholars, that Deborah being raised up as a judge was in itself a judgment on Israel. This was probably the most impactful way to show how weak the men were in Israel, that there were no men who were worthy to serve as a judge at that time. Now, look, with millions of men, was that the case? I don't know. But look at the weakness shown by Barak, the man God chose to lead the rebellion. He wouldn't go do what God instructed him to unless Deborah went with him. I kind of think that's what was going on here. The Israelites were being ruled over by Deborah, a woman, because of how far they had fallen. Now, can I say that for certain? No. But it makes the most sense out of the proposed theories, in my opinion. And now that we know exactly who Deborah is, we know all we'd ever want to know about her, as long as all we ever really wanted to know was that very tiny snippet of her life that was given to us in the Bible. But now we can move on to the article in question for today, found on usnews.com from 2008. Headline, as a military leader, Deborah is a rare biblical character. Subtitle, Facing Down 900 Chariots of Iron. Let's see what our author, Mr. Andrew Curry, and no doubt a handful of professors and or theologians and scholars have to say about Deborah. Judging by the actual biblical account and how Mr. Curry entitled or, bylined his article, this isn't going to go well. At no point do we see Deborah acting as a military leader. She told Barak to go gather men, just as God told her to tell him. Then she told Barak to go down and fight, just as God told him he was supposed to do, and apparently he wasn't doing it. That's not a military leader, though. She also played no part in anything to do with the 900 chariots. She's not mentioned after she told him to go fight until the next chapter when she's singing, so... But surely those will be the only mistakes made by Mr. Curry, right? Just the title and the subtitle. Oh, no, that's not right. You've got to hear how he starts this thing. It's good. I'll give him that. Quote,
From her seat in the shade of a palm tree, Deborah looked out over the highlands of Israel. These dry hills were her people's home, and she could see all was not well. In the valley below, armed bands preyed on Israelite peasants. Travelers and caravans, the lifeblood of her region, were too frightened to take the main roads. It was a time of chaos, a time that called for strong leadership. In answering the call, Deborah became a singular biblical figure, a female military leader. She recruited a man at the general Barak to stand by her side, telling him God wanted the armies of Israel to attack the Canaanites who were persecuting the highland tribes. Barak was reluctant, and he insisted that Deborah go with him to the battle. Her answer was assertive and prophetic. I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman.
Sounds pretty epic, right? 3/4 of that came from verses 5 and 6. That's a lot of stuff they pulled out of 5 and 6. That she used to sit under a palm tree, sons of Israel would come to her for judgment, and then she summoned Barak because God told her to. The rest, made up out of whole cloth. Twisted. Or we could just call it an outright lie. For instance, she didn't recruit Barak. She summoned him because God told her to summon him. Her answer that she was going to go with him to the battle was not assertive. It was probably actually fairly judgmental, to be honest. I would imagine an eye roll, a sigh. Oh, fine. I'll go with you, you big pansy. You want me to hold your binky while you go fight? That sort of thing. That's kind of how I imagine it. But remember, our narrative throughout the Hear Them Roar miniseries is strong female character. Our author goes on stating that it was, quote, an unlikely commander who led the army to a decisive battle with the Canaanites, which I'd agree. Sounds like Barak wasn't the typical warrior general type. But no, it's not who our author's speaking of. Quote, Deborah's army of 10,000 Israelites rushed down from the hills. Yeah, it's not Deborah's army. It's still not Deborah's army. It's Barak's army, or if you want to go one step further, more accurately, it's God's army. But what it definitely was not was Deborah's army. He, now referencing Judges 5, says that the Song of Deborah is one of the oldest in the Bible, and I would probably agree with that. He says, quote, it says the stars strayed from their courses and the river washed Sisera's armies away in a massive flood. The battle was a total victory. And no, it doesn't quite say that. In fact, looking at Bible Hub at their extended list of translations for verse number 20, encompassing nearly 40 translations from Old to Modern, Catholic to Aramaic, not one of them used the word strayed when referring to the stars. Our author made that up, and I'm not sure why, to be honest. Nor does it say anything about a flood, or at least only the Good News translation says flood. Many translations speak of the torrent of the river Kishon, but that to me doesn't, imply a flood. It implies the current of the river, maybe even a strong current, but it doesn't imply flood to me. The verses in question in the LSB say this, quote, the kings came and fought, then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh, near the waters of Megiddo. They took no gain of silver. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The river of Kishon swept them away, the ancient river, the river Kishon. So what does it mean when it speaks of the stars and the river? Well, the MacArthur Study Bible says that these two verses mean that God sent a great storm from above, which hid the stars with the clouds and made it hard for the army to attack, the enemy army to attack, because apparently the Israelite army would have no problem attacking in the storm. But it also made apparently this flood that we speak of that swept them away from their chariots. Now, don't tell Johnny Mac. I don't need him sending his goon squad after me here. That's not how I read this. I see nothing in the literal account of chapter 4 that says any of this. The Hebrew word for stars is K-O-K-A-B, pronounced something like Koshav, right? It's used 37 times in the Old Testament. In most cases, it's used when God promises to multiply Abraham's or Isaac or Jacob's seed like the stars in the sky. In fact, it appears that in almost every case, it's referring to the literal flaming balls of gas and who knows what else that float around in our universe. However, it doesn't always mean that. For instance, Job 38:7 says, quote, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we generally look at that phrasing as figurative language for the angels, right? And we see this in chapter 4. Yahweh threw the opposing army into confusion. So the way that I read this, I think God, who gave the battle to Barak and the army of 10,000, gave it into their hands, sent his angels to assist by causing mass confusion with the opposing forces. And as God said, he was going to draw them to the river Kishon. I think that as the battle raged, the bodies of the slaughtered probably rolled down the banks and were swept away with the river, at least to some degree. That's what I would take from Deborah's song, which is figurative, yes, but it has some very literal lyrics inside that song as well. So, this is a pretty minor statement back in our article. Why do I take such umbrage with how he phrased it or how he interpreted it? Well, because what he's done, for the sake of his agenda, speaking of our author here, is place Deborah on a pedestal at the top. God, of course, told her to do the things, sure. But in the grand scheme of things, according to this author's article, God is he's just kind of a bit player in this narrative. As for Barak, well, I mean, he's there. But he's got all this mixed up, right? At least thus far. Deborah was actually the bit player. She was, in this account, a mouthpiece of God. She told Barak what God told him to do on a couple occasions. Barak did it, with a little nudging from Deborah to do what God told him to do. But God, the sovereign God, placed the pieces where he wanted them. He dictated the terms of the army, who would lead them, how many to have, which tribes to pull the men from. God gave the enemy into Barak's hand exactly where he said he would do so, and God caused the confusion in the army of the Canaanites, which allowed Barak's army to slaughter them. God is who this entire account is about. Again, Deborah, I believe, was there as a judgment by God on Israel for lacking strong male leadership. Back to our Mr. Curry. He ends his retelling with the tent peg through the head of the Canaanite army commander. He then states that the Bible rarely places a woman in the role of warrior or general, citing Susan Ackerman, who we've met before. She's our, quote, religion and women's and gender studies professor at Dartmouth College. He quoted her as saying, quote, every other instance we have of women acting in a military context is of a woman acting as an assassin, using sexual attraction to lure male war leaders to their deaths. Deborah, in terms of the portrayal of her taking the lead as a military commander, is unique. And I totally agree. It's so unique, it didn't even happen. The scholars with their mind-blowing insights, however, keep coming. Mr. Curry makes the astute observation that the account is, quote, essentially told twice. First in a sort of prose summary in Judges 4, and then in a poem or song in Judges 5. Hold that thought for a moment. Let's allow Professor Tikva Freimer-Kensky of the University of Chicago Divinity School, who wrote in her book, Women of Scripture, add in her 2 cents, which, with inflation, is probably about $80 gabagillion today. Quote, the song may be one of the Bible's oldest texts, probably composed not long after the original events, possibly by Deborah herself. Okay, for review. A poem or maybe a song, probably composed not long after the original events, possibly composed by Deborah herself. Got it? These are the insights from our biblical scholar brain trust. Keep this clear in your mind. Judges, chapter 5, verse 1, and I quote, then Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, sang on that day, saying. End of quote. Sang, that implies it's a song, Mr. Curry. That implies it's a song. On that day. Now, that can be taken a variety of ways. It sure seems to, if I utilize my context clues properly, imply that it was composed, not long after the original events. Like on that day. And Deborah and Barak sang. Seems to suggest or hint or intimate that Deborah quite possibly may have composed this sucker by herself, or maybe even, and I know I'm going way out on a limb here, composed it with Barak. A D&B joint, if you will. Our Mr. Curry then goes into an exposition with the help of our Professor Ricky Tikva Freimer Kensky Tavi of the differences between Chapter 4, the historical account or prose, and Chapter 5, the song or perhaps poetry. Mr. Curry says that Chapter 4 seems much more traditional with, quote, Deborah as sort of a cheerleader and prophet, urging the troops into battle from the sidelines. He also makes a point of saying that this prose account was likely written much later. Okay, first, yes, it had to be written later because they sang their song that day, but to his point that the prose account sets Deborah up as a cheerleader and prophet urging the troops from the sidelines, well, that's because that's literally what she did. I think probably at the most. I don't know about the cheerleader part, but she was the prophetess, more accurately the judge, and she did urge Barak to get his men a-movin'. Professor Tikva says of Chapter 5, which, remember, may be a song possibly written soon after all these events, maybe even by Deborah herself, that the, quote, Song of Deborah shows none of this unease about women warriors in language that is powerful, even in translation, and often deeply sexual in the original, according to some scholars. The song represents Deborah as a war leader in her own right. The peasantry prospered in Israel. They grew fat on plunder. Because you arose, Deborah arose as a mother in Israel. And Jael's murder of the enemy general Sisera is a poetic study in bravery and brutality. He asked water. She gave him milk. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hand to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. He sank. He fell. He lay still at her feet. Well, they, along with Ackerman, believe that Chapter 4 may have come about as a, quote, result of an effort to rewrite history, or at least reshape mythology, because no way would those ancient Jews allow some useless weak woman in a position of prominence or power, or even let her speak or be seen or whatever, because that's what we see all through the Bible, right? And don't you dare question anything about that. See, I'd read in the poem, or possibly even the song, that they sang that day, the part about, quote, until I, Deborah, arose, until I arose a mother in Israel, as giving us a time reference. She started her song with the prosperity of Israel, then the few judges before her, then the fall from grace for the nation of Israel into oppression, then things changed at the time she was made judge. The next verse after her stating these things is that they started changing at the time that she arose as a judge. It says this, quote, God chose new leaders, then war was in the gates. She wasn't talking about herself as being something special. She's simply laying out the timeline in her song. She spoke of herself in the same manner she mentioned the few judges before her, to put a time reference in the song. As for Jael, well, I wouldn't even think of disparaging her bravery. What she did was both clever and brave, there's no question. Sisera, the commander of the Canaanite army, was exhausted already. Rather than just a little bit of water, how about some nice yummy cheese and a nice glass of warm milk? And as that belly's digesting and he's in his deep, deep sleep from his meal and milk and exhaustion, she drove a likely fairly pointed, fairly large, fairly solid peg through his head. If the first blow was strong enough to pop through the temple, he wasn't going to get up and protest. Let's just say that. Would have only taken one blow to kill him. Then just nail him to the floor, I guess for good measure. Brave, kind of gross, brave, but we have nothing that tells us she was a warrior. She was more of a clever, courageous opportunist. Right person, right time, God's sovereignty. And this notion that the author of Judges would lie and change the narrative in Chapter 4 to try to kind of write Deborah as some sort of lesser person because that's what they were supposed to do with that. I don't know. Well, that's Fantasy Island. They so want Deborah to be the strong, medieval, Norse-looking Viking warrior chick. But she wasn't, at least not from what we're told in the few verses that speak of her. And keep in mind, if the author of Judges lied in writing Chapter 4, that implicates the Holy Spirit as well, right? The ultimate author of Judges, it would make him a liar, or at least complicit in lies, or maybe just oblivious as to what was going on in the book. Or even worse, powerless as God to do anything about the lies that are being written. They're desperately trying to make this, Deborah warrior queen thing happen, and it ain't gonna happen. But this may all be moot anyway. See, Deborah may just be a fictional person. The author cites, quote, most scholars today, which is a pretty bold claim, saying that she has most scholars, that they say they believe the book of Judges was really just kind of made up of hand-picked stories and myths and traditional songs and folk tales, etc., and just kind of conglomerated into this one book in order to make a point. Remember, the Bible is totally man-made, right? This is the narrative we're going off of, so this is totally possible if that's the case. In fact, it's kind of hard to verify any of the cast of characters in Judges, but it's really inconsequential if the people are real. It's what we or they can learn from these fairy tales. That's what the author or authors cared about by writing the book of Judges. In fact, Deborah may not even be a real person. She may be a figment of our imagination, an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about Deborah, whatever she is. Our dear author, Mr. Curry, goes on to cite, no, not most scholars today. This time he cites, quote, a growing school of biblical historians who have uncovered the absolute fact that the Israelites were and are really nothing more than Canaanites who converted to a new monotheistic religion. I mean, if most scholars today, and if a growing school of biblical historians say these things, how could you or I ever possibly hope to counter these nameless, faceless science hordes? Ackerman, our religion and women's and gender studies professor at Dartmouth College, had written a book entitled Warrior, Dancer, Seductress, Queen, Women in Judges and Biblical Israel, which is probably just a curl-up reading one setting page-turner. She says that Deborah is likely just an adopted Canaanite myth because, come on, quote, with its supernatural imagery of stars falling from the heavens and rushing floods, God isn't just blessing the troops, but is quite an actor. Deborah might be sort of a demythologized warrior goddess taken from an older mythological tradition. And Ackerman is absolutely correct. Deborah may be that. And I may be 6'6", 3% body fat, and on my way to steal your girl. But I'm not, and neither is Deborah a demythologized warrior goddess. Nowhere in the 2 chapters does it paint Deborah as some sort of warrior. She's just not. I have no idea where they're getting that, except that for simply just out of their heads. The account that we have given to us by God never even alludes to Deborah being a warrior. And most of the judges are, in fact. The Bible doesn't seem to be shy about telling us these feats of these various judges. We're told specifically that Othniel went to war. Ehud plunged that sword into the fat belly of the king. Shamgar had 1 verse in the entire Bible, and we're told that he killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. The list goes on. Some we know almost nothing about. Some we know quite well, like Samson. He seemed to do his fair share of slaughter that they wrote about. Even Samuel, in his older age, hacked King Agag to pieces. Now, we're not told that all of them were warriors. But we are told that Deborah, after calling Barak, had him plead with her to come to the battle with him. Her intent, it appears, wasn't even to go. It was likely to sit under the palm tree and continue to act as a judge while Barak went out and did what God told him to do. If Deborah was so much like Xena, the warrior princess, don't you think the Holy Spirit would have told us? But no, because I guess misogyny or something. But what's the point of all this? Well, the author of this article tells us the main point, the most important message of the book of Judges, quote, over and over again, Israel's saviors are unlikely heroes. By emphasizing the inappropriateness of the hero, readers were reminded of God's importance. Quoting Everett Fox, and here we go again, deep breath on this one, quote, the Alan M. Glick Professor of Judaic and Biblical Studies at Clark University in Massachusetts and the author of a widely acclaimed, didn't take a deep enough breath, translation of the first 5 books of the Bible. Oh, man. So we're all going to become enlightened now. She says, quote, God can do whatever he wants, and if he wants to work through non-soldiers, that is women, he can. If you can be rescued by a housewife, it just goes to show God works in mysterious ways. Well, he sure does. Here's the thing. I don't know if Fox is implying Deborah was a housewife, but we have nothing that says that either. This article, doozy of an article for our last segment in our Hear Them Roar miniseries, makes you ask yourself, did any of these scholars read these 2 chapters? Did they read the book of Judges? Have they, at any time in the past, Your Honor, read a Bible at all? Because it feels like they're more interested in doing some creative writing than in reading and expositing the actual text. Why is the text, as written, not adequate for these people, these alleged scholars? That's all I really want to know. So the point of the book of Judges is that God can use whoever he wants, including really messed up people, right? That's what we're told, right? Well, that is true. I'm not going to argue that. In fact, I sure hope that's true. Otherwise, I'm kind of hosed. Paul called himself the chief of sinners, and we see him as likely the greatest apostle of them all. And no, he wasn't talking about himself pre-conversion, despite what, again, some scholars want to say, intending to paint Paul post-conversion, some sort of perfect saint. He was talking about his life post-conversion. He did what he didn't want to do, and he didn't do what he knew he was supposed to do. And although I guarantee that if you place Paul and myself on a balance, I would come up woefully short, it doesn't change the fact that Paul was a sinner, say by the grace of God alone, and had his sinful struggles on the daily. Do the kids still say it that way? And I keep thinking, am I missing something about this account, about Deborah? But I mean, literally, her name is mentioned 9 times, 9 verses, all in Judges 4 and 5, and that's it. So reading chapter 4 and 5, I just don't see what these scholars, so-called, are saying. And the fact that I can't figure out why they're saying what they're saying makes it pretty easy to determine why they're saying what they're saying. But back to the point of Judges. Yes, in Judges and throughout the entire Bible, we see that God never once sought the perfect, because that didn't, doesn't, and won't ever exist with regard to humanity, not in this existence at least. Some of who we learn about in the Bible are better than others. Some only had a few screw-ups. Some were unmitigated disasters, but none were perfect. God uses people to bring about his plan. God is sovereign. God is the potter, we are the clay. God has every right to use man as he sees fit for his plan, to bring him glory, and for the ultimate good of his children. So what is the point of the book of Judges? Well, first of all, it's history. Real history, not a myth. I can say that with absolute confidence because the Holy Spirit is the supreme author of the Bible. He isn't, by his very nature, going to mislead or outright lie. He can't. That would violate his nature as being God, and the one thing God can't do is not be God. So this book is, 3 or 4 centuries? It's a bridge from the death of Joshua to the first king of Israel. We get a very brief glimpse in relation to the amount of time that passes into the general direction of Israel. And that's the next point. It's a book to show the progression of futility in man trying to do things his own way. The absolute impossibility for man to just follow the rules in their own strength. Throughout Judges, we see the sinfulness of the people, the wrath of God, the oppression of his chosen people, using other nations for his purposes because of the sin and idolatry of the Israelites, the repentance of Israel, and the unending forgiveness and unfathomable mercy of God. But we start with the death of Joshua, and in a generation, the wickedness of the Israelites is on full display. Lather, rinse, repeat. Then we end with, quote, "In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And there was no king. There was no earthly king in Israel, which is how 1 Samuel, after 7 chapters of background of additional history, starts, with Israel demanding an earthly king. But more importantly, the Israelites had rejected Yahweh God as their king. God was still exercising mercy at the appropriate times after the Israelites, had some brain flatulence and realized that maybe their absolute rejection of their God is the cause of their problems. But generally speaking, God had been rejected as their king. Although Samuel, the final judge, would take offense at Israel asking for an earthly king, God was like, nah, it's fine. It's not you, it's me they don't like. It's literally been like this for a long time. Frankly, I'm over it. As I've told my kid a number of times, because she's a teenager, I'll never stop loving you, but I don't always like you. I doubt God thinks at such a base level, but that's kind of the impression I get here as well. Anyway, the book of Judges shows you and I how much we need a Savior. We're all saved by works, but those works are the works of Jesus, not ourselves, credited to our account. We're not able to follow the law, to do the works perfectly in order to save ourselves. And we see this played out over and over in the book of Judges. The Israelites come back in sincere repentance. They mourn, they weep, they sacrifice, they commit to following the laws of God, and then they fail yet again, in the exact same way. How much different from them are we? We must remember that God, as I said, is sovereign. God knows the end from the beginning because he has determined all things from the beginning to the end. The events in the book of Judges are both an account of the sinfulness of the Israelites by following their inclination toward rebellion against God, and the sovereign plan of God to bring humanity to the point where the God-man would come and fulfill that law perfectly, obeying the Father, and ultimately sacrificing himself to make a way for you and I to live for eternity with him, to be rescued from the futility and frustration of this life, and most importantly, from the wrath of God poured out in full measure on us for our sin. The fact that God uses imperfect people is clearly shown, but that's not the point of the book of Judges. It's comforting to see, speaking personally, as I know, I know what a fallen creature am I. But it's only so well illustrated because there's no other kind of human for God to use. In fact, this is one of the greatest proofs of the veracity and accuracy of the biblical account. No man-made book is written like the Bible. No slate of heroes is ever shown to be such absolute fallen failures. This book is unique out of all the millions of books written across all of history. Judges is honestly a sad book. There are some amazing things that happened. We see an all-powerful sovereign God. We see mercy after mercy, but we start with Joshua at the end of his life, leaving God's chosen people in the promised land, conquering the land that God had given them, and then we end with no king, no direction, and a rejection of the God of Moses and Joshua. And thusly and heretofore, our Hear Them Roar miniseries comes to an end. 9 parts, 9 extremely strong female characters who were gracious enough to lend their very particular sets of skills to God. Yeah. I started this thing by saying that when I taught kids in Sunday school, I used to tell them to pay close attention anytime a woman is named in the Bible, and especially if she's part of a story in the Bible. And I still stand by that statement. We should all pay close attention when a woman is central character in a biblical account. But what we must never do is turn her into something or someone she wasn't. God placed every single person in the Bible and in all of history exactly where they and we need to be for the accomplishment of his ultimate plan. We know absolutely everything we need to know about these women. Wild speculation isn't necessary, and it isn't allowed if we want to read our Bibles rightly. There is plenty to learn from each and every woman in our little mini-series, and in the Bible in general, that we don't need to glorify them, turning them into something they aren't. Read the Bible as written. Use trusted resources to help flesh out the setting, and then trust God that he's given you 100% of what we need to know to bring him the maximum glory and us the maximum good. Hear these women roar? Absolutely. But let them roar no more and no less than God intends for them. Well, we're very nearly done with 10 out of however many months we have this year. 12 or so, if memory serves. Can you believe that it's almost voting time? Can you believe that our current president survived both the 25th Amendment and the Grim Reaper, what appears to be his full 4-year term? I can't. I really thought that one of those two, if not both, were going to get him. But then, right after voting, whatever may happen there, we still have Thanksgiving. I don't think they'll take Christmas away. Then New Year's. And that brings in 2025. And how are you doing on creating your goals for 2025? I can tell you that I haven't started yet, but I've thought about it at least a little bit. But before we get to that, we need to hit goal update number 9, 2024 edition. Well, as has been my apparent custom or pattern or whatever it is, while most people work to get that perfect bathing suit body for the summer, I apparently am wired to desire the perfect snowsuit body. As in, it seems like my natural clock and my heart says, hey, fatty, do something or we quit. And it normally says that in the fall. And that's what I've been doing. Something. So starting with weight, well, I've been watching calories for the most part, definitely tracking them, and I've been working out pretty regular-like, and as of Friday, I was at 198.9 pounds. That, my friends, is the first time I've seen less than 200 pounds so far this year. See? Something. That's down about 3.3 pounds from the last update. Now, no, that's not stellar speed. but I never intended it to be. My idea at the beginning of the year, for whatever that was to do this nice and slow, which is not how I've done it in the past, and I've failed pretty much every time. So I'm kind of good with a nice slow pace. Now, I'm down 10.9 pounds from the beginning of the year, and although some may say, the haters mostly, that losing an average of just over 1 pound a month is pretty pitiful, I got nothing. I mean, they're pretty right on that, actually. But so far, so good for the last quarter of the year, making progress. Now, I swapped magical scales. I got one with the little pull-out handlebar thingy. It has more electrodes than just the foot pads. It's supposed to give you more, comprehensive data on your fat and muscle and distribution of all of that, etc., etc. I'll say that the weight seems to be very close with the last scale. Now, the rest, I don't know. Jury's still out on it. Maybe I'll report on this thing more in the next update. But it definitely has a higher fat and a higher muscle value, so maybe it's better data. Maybe it's just different calculations. Maybe it's all a sham to get people to spend money on scales that just kind of make it up as they go along, like a random number generator in there or something. I don't know. So this one says that my fat percentage is 28.6%. I'm a little offended, but that dropped by a pretty substantial amount in the last week or so that I've been using it, so maybe it's figuring me out. I don't know. The value that it gave me is about 10% higher than my old scale, but in theory, with all the electrodes, it should be more accurate. So I don't know. At the same time, it says that I'm 66.6% muscle, and should I be concerned about that beastly number? That percentage is about 14% higher than my old scale. So, look, I'm cool with that. I think that is spot on. Like I said, jury's still out on the scale. Overall, the bottom line, making progress. The type of progress that had I been making it at the beginning of the year, I would simply be maintaining right now. But I chose a different path, a stupid path, as it turns out. Okay, moving on. Reading. So in my last book review, I think I mentioned that I'm in the middle of like 5 books right now. That's sort of true. One is for Sunday school, so that's a couple of really short chapters every week. One I started, but I've kind of put it to the side for right now, as I decided to work on a different one while I'm working on some other ones. One goes along with my Bible reading, so it's not like I'm flip-flopping through 5 or 6 books just constantly trying to read a page here and a page there. But speaking of pages, as of right now, I've read 3,861 pages for the year. That's 85.8% of my goal for the year, slightly ahead of the about 82.7% that I'd need to be at this point. So that's going all right. Fairly confident that I can knock that goal out. It's not a definite yet. I'll be very close, but I think I can hit it. Moving to days in the Bible. I'm sitting really close on this one as well. My goal is 5 days of focused Bible reading per week, which could really span anywhere from like 15 minutes on a rushed morning to maybe an hour or so on a Saturday morning. As of right now, I'm at 99.3% of my goal pace. Some weeks are better than others, but I'm hanging right in there, so I'm pretty happy with that. It's not perfect, could be better, but I'm fairly happy with that. Duolingo. I mentioned last time that I swapped to Italian from Greek. Much happier with that choice for a variety of reasons. Look, the Greek module, I don't know if it's newer in the Duolingo world, or if it's just harder to do. I'm really not sure where we're at on that, but the Greek module seems to be much less developed than the Italian module. In the Italian, you do some typing of words, you do some speaking, there are more varieties of types of lessons and so on, and I was just kind of burnt out on Greek. It wasn't fun, I wasn't learning, I wasn't interested anymore. It was just kind of the same thing, just hammered just over and over. There was no variety. I don't know. I'm probably a little too ADHD to really do the Greek one, at least right now. Italian, I at least feel like I am actually learning something. Now, the program itself, Duolingo, they've also added in, interestingly, math stuff. Not like Italian math, just math, right? Which right now is very basic. Okay, so I've played with that a little bit. I don't know. It's kind of fun being a math guy. This goes quick and I don't know, it's just kind of interesting. They've also added in a music module, which I played around with a little bit. That's interesting. It's just kind of, I'm at the very basic level, and it just really goes to show that I have no musical talent whatsoever. All that said, my streak is still alive and well, 316 days as of the time of this writing, and I'm at 139% of my goal pace of 70 minutes per week. Again, some weeks are better than others. Some weeks are not really so good, but at least, again, I'm doing something. Finally, prayer. This is one of the ones that I'm struggling with the most. This is the one I'm struggling with the most. And for whatever reason, I kind of get the impression that most people struggle with prayer, just in general. So my goal was 5 days a week in focused prayer, and that could last for 15 minutes to maybe 45 minutes. It just depends. As of now, I'm sitting right at 80%. So not 5 days a week, 4 days a week is really what I've been doing, which again isn't nothing, but it's definitely not what I wanted it to be, not what it should be. And even if I ran the table at this point, 7 days per week for the rest of the weeks of the year, about the best I could hit is 90% of my goal. So this is a goal that will be carried over into 2025, restarted with an attempt at a renewed focus. Interestingly, I just listened to a Martin Lloyd-Jones sermon from probably 1960s. I think that's where most of these are coming from. This was just the other day, and he was talking about prayer and how we really don't pray the way we're told to pray, the way that's modeled for us by the apostles. He had some really good points. I think that's one thing for 2025 that I want to do is pray better. Quantity is good. No matter how you do it, quantity is good. But quality needs to be given consideration as well. Am I just plopping down with my wish list? Am I giving God praise? And how do I do that? What does that look like? If you look through the Psalms, for instance, the various psalmists spend a lot of time telling God who he is. Well, that's worship of God for his attributes. That's prayer. And that's harder than you'd think. I was trying that for a while, and I just felt like I was getting into this habit of kind of a prayer preamble, right? You start with kind of the same thing over and over again, and you're racking your brain. Well, how do I change this up? Who is God? And he's these things. I don't know. And then you walk through your wish list. So anyway, I need to do some real thinking on that goal for 2025. Okay, well, that's pretty much it. Short and sweet, just like me. Sorry, about to wrap this up. Then you can go wipe the vomit off your shirt. So look, 2024 goal-wise has been okay. Not great, not terrible. It's shaping up to be okay. By the end of November, I hope to have at least a good working idea of goals for 2025. And look, whether you set any goals for this year or not, I'd strongly suggest that you set some for 2025. Even if you're someone who is organized and has everything structured and you're just on point, on target, day in and day out, how are you doing on your sanctification? That's one thing I want to put more focus on for my goals for 2025 that I kind of got away from for 2024. How will accomplishing my goals for 2025 increase my fruits of the Spirit, for instance? I can tell you that one thing rattling around in the skull of mine that I have no idea how to quantify or track is to get to know people at the church. Like I said, it's a new church. I know I've been there for a while now, but it's kind of a new church. I'm an introvert. I'm a pretty shy person until I get to know you. I just kind of keep to myself. And in this church, it's a bigger church, not huge, but it is bigger. I'm one of only, I think, a few people that I know of who is divorced. I'm coming to church most of the time with my kid, but some of the time by myself. And I'm not the one to just kind of bust up in someone's conversation. That's like the worst thing ever to think of doing. So getting to know people, not easy for me, never has been. For 2025 and really starting this year, I need to plug into a small group and get involved with some various aspects of the church, inner workings, etc. That's something vital to my growth as a Christian. How do I make a goal about that? How do I track that? I have no idea. I say all that to give you the idea that not all goals can be quantified like a number of days doing this or a number of pages read or pounds lost. There are aspects of life, I have aspects of my life that are lagging. We all do. So goals for 2025, I want to try and address some of those things as well. Just don't know how. So I need to be thinking about them. You need to be thinking about them. More about that in the coming weeks. Okay, so as always, you have any questions, comments, ideas, tips, or tricks, or whatever, let me know. Contact info is in the episode notes like always, so keep pushing. Okay, bye. And with that, sadly, we've reached the end of yet another episode of the Logical Christian Podcast. I feel we've bonded as we've laughed and cried and twisted our faces in incredulity. If you've enjoyed or found value in what you've heard, go on and do all the podcast things, and don't forget to check the show notes for links and contact info. Lawrence J. Peters said, "Against logic there is no armor like ignorance." Jesus told us that if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So stay in the word, stay logical, stay faithful, and until next time, God bless.